In many parts of the world, young people grow up with freedom they don't even have to think about. They wake up each morning knowing they can speak their mind, wear what they want, and walk down the street without asking for permission. They go to school with classmates who become friends, and in the evenings, they head to the mall, the movies, or someone's house just to laugh and be young. They dance under colorful lights in loud clubs, record fun videos on TikTok, share updates on Facebook, and scroll through Instagram for hours. They post selfies, talk openly about crushes, tell jokes, dream big dreams, and chase them. They decide what kind of life they want to live, who they want to share it with, and how they want to be remembered. But not everyone lives in that world. In other places, a life like that isn't just far away, it's forbidden. In those places, freedom isn't normal, it's dangerous. And for someone like Layla Haroun, even the smallest piece of it came with a heavy cost. Layla wasn't spending her days with friends. She wasn't laughing on video calls or planning weekend trips. She was behind closed doors, cleaning floors on her knees, folding laundry for a house that never felt like hers, cooking meals for people who never asked what she wanted. Her time was not her own. Her body was not her own. Even her thoughts had to be quiet, because too much hope was dangerous. She lived in a place where her voice didn't matter, where the choices made for her were meant to last forever, where questioning the rules meant questioning her worth. While others her age were finding their voice, Layla was being forced to lose hers. She was pulled from school before she could finish her childhood, married to someone she didn't choose, told who she belonged to, what her place was, and what she must never ask for, freedom. But one day, she tried. She tried to leave, to protect herself, to find a life beyond control and fear. She reached out, not for revenge, not for attention, but for safety. What happened next remains one of the deadliest events recorded till date. This is not just a story of a soul who was silenced. This is the true story of Layla Haroun, a young wife, a mother, a voice the world can no longer ignore. Welcome to the crime series. Before we begin, do us a quick favor. Drop your location and the time you're watching this in the comments. We want to know where you're tuning in from, because these stories matter everywhere. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Layla Haroun was born in October 2005 in Ahvaz, a conservative city nestled in the rural outskirts of southwestern Iran. The city, steeped in age-old customs and unbending tradition, existed in a world where the expectations of women were drawn from generations of quiet compliance. In neighborhoods lined with sun-cracked bricks and dust-laden alleyways, every step in a woman's life was meticulously charted, first by her father, then by her husband, and finally by her fate. She was the first child of Majid Haroun, a stern local taxi driver known for his rigid principles and unwavering belief in patriarchal order. Her mother, Sabah Haroun, came from a lineage of full-time housewives and had herself never stepped outside the bounds of home and family. Like the women before her, Sabah had been raised with the understanding that her value rested in her ability to care for the home and bear children. In the Haroun household, tradition wasn't just respected, it was enforced. Layla grew up alongside three younger siblings, two brothers and a baby sister, in a modest single-story home on the edge of the city. The environment was tight-knit and deeply religious. Public opinion carried as much weight as the law, and personal freedom, especially for women, was a concept rarely spoken of. Life moved slowly in Ahvaz, but it moved with purpose. Girls were prepared for domestic life from an early age, and boys were groomed to become breadwinners. Despite the limits placed around her from an early age, Layla Haroun carried something within her that no rule could fully suppress: an observant mind and a spirit full of quiet questions. She was the kind of child who listened more than she spoke, but her silence was not emptiness, it was awareness. Every moment, every gesture in her household, every whispered word among adults, she absorbed with sharp attention. Her days were filled with tasks expected of her. She swept the narrow rooms of their modest home. She soothed her younger siblings with songs passed down from older generations. She did these things not with complaint, but with the patience of someone who understood, even without being told, that this was the only way to be accepted in her world. But inside her, something else lived, a longing she could never name out loud. That longing found its first outlet through the tattered books passed to her in secret by her older cousin, Soraya, who had once studied in Shiraz before marriage, pulled her life in another direction. These books, worn and faded, were usually missing covers and often held pages stained with tea or dust. But to Layla, they were treasure. Stories of places she had never seen, women who spoke their minds, characters who made choices, faced consequences, and still kept going. She didn't always understand every word, but she understood the feeling, the desire to be more. Her favorite was a poetry collection, nameless and half-destroyed, but with verses that made her heart race. At night, when her chores were done and her siblings asleep, she would sneak into the corner of the room closest to the window and reread the same lines under a flashlight, lips moving in silence. Sometimes she tried to write her own, scribbling on scrap paper or old calendar pages. The words weren't perfect, but they were hers. Her schoolteacher, a kind woman named Madame Barraza, had once pulled her aside after a language assignment and said, "You see the world with different eyes, Layla. Don't stop writing." That was the only time someone outside her family acknowledged her potential. It stayed with her. Layla flourished in subjects that allowed expression. Literature, composition, even history, but she struggled with math and science, not because she lacked the ability, but because her mind was often elsewhere. She was imagining things, creating stories in her head, worlds where choices belonged to the person who lived them. But that world was not hers. In 2016, when Layla was still on the edge of childhood, her time in school came to an abrupt end. Her father, Majid, gave no detailed explanation, just a short remark about needing help at home. But the real reason was unspoken and understood by everyone in the community. Once a girl began to mature, her education was considered unnecessary, even dangerous. Books could plant ideas, school could build opinions, and opinions could lead to questions no father wanted to answer. So Layla's uniform was folded and packed away, her notebooks were quietly removed. One morning, she simply stopped going. No farewell to classmates, no explanation to her teacher. Just a quiet disappearance from a space where she had once felt something close to possibility. The loss was not just educational, it was emotional. The place where her imagination had once been encouraged was gone. And in its place came something far more rigid: preparation. From that point on, her daily routines began to shift subtly. Her mother started showing her how to cook larger meals, how to wash laundry by hand without bruising the fabric, how to host male elders with the right balance of respect and invisibility. Her time was no longer hers. It was for the house, for the family, and soon, for the man who would be chosen for her. Later that same year, a suitor was proposed. Karim Jalali, a distant relative from the nearby town of Farsabad, known for its traditional households and deep-rooted views on family structure and gender roles. Karim, born in 1996, was nearly 10 years older than Layla. By the time the proposal reached the Haroun household, Karim had already established a reputation in his community, not for kindness or intellect, but for his quiet control and strict personality. Karim came from a household shaped entirely by male dominance. His father, a weathered mason, had spent decades laying bricks and mortar under the hot Iranian sun, often with calloused hands and little patience. The family was not wealthy, but they took pride in their rigidity. Men were to be obeyed, women were to serve, and marriage was not about love but about order. His mother, like Sabah Haroun, had never worked outside the home. Her life was contained within four walls, and her influence was limited to household duties and hosting family gatherings. Karim himself had left school in his early teens. He had never shown interest in books or academic life. Instead, he followed in his father's path, working in construction and later moving into basic metalworking jobs around the industrial edges of Farsabad. His days were defined by labor, lifting beams, welding sheets, and learning to keep his emotions behind clenched teeth. But those close to him knew that his temper was not always easy to hide. He was known for his sudden outbursts, his cold silences, and his deep discomfort with anything that challenged his authority. Yet in a town like his, this was often mistaken for discipline. When Karim's name was first mentioned, Layla's father, Majid, didn't hesitate. To him, the match made sense. Karim had work, steady, masculine, respectable. He came from a known family. He upheld tradition. That alone checked all the boxes. There were no questions about Layla's thoughts, no conversations about her readiness, no considerations for the life she might want. The families met only once before the decision was made. Tea was served, prayers were exchanged, and Karim barely spoke. He glanced at Layla once, just long enough to see her lowered gaze and stiff posture. No one asked him how he felt about her. It was assumed that his agreement was automatic and that Layla's silence meant approval. In reality, she hadn't spoken at all. Her opinion wasn't just ignored, it was irrelevant. Within days, the engagement was formalized. Simple gold bands were exchanged, and dates were discussed. The event was not a celebration, but a transaction. To the families involved, everything was going as it should. A young woman was being placed in a respectable home, with a working husband and a clear role. She moved into Karim's family home, a small, crowded structure that housed his parents and 2 younger brothers. The transition was immediate and jarring. Layla, once a girl who found solace in books and quiet contemplation, was now responsible for household duties and subject to the unspoken rules that governed her new family's life. Each task was expected to be performed without question. Her place was at the side of her husband and under the instruction of her in-laws. Karim proved to be a dominating presence. While publicly restrained, he was private and controlling at home. His expectations were firm, shaped by a worldview that placed male authority above all else. Any resistance from Layla, emotional or practical, was met with cold disregard or intimidation. Over time, she began to retreat into herself, her earlier vibrancy replaced by silence and submission. In 2019, 2 years into the marriage, Layla gave birth to a son, Rafi, named after husband-father's uncle. The child brought a flicker of joy to her otherwise narrow world. Motherhood, despite its challenges, gave her a sense of purpose she had been denied in other parts of her life. She cherished the quiet moments when she could hold him close, hum lullabies from her childhood, and whisper stories she'd once dreamed of writing. But even this joy was accompanied by the heavy burden of responsibility and scrutiny. Raising Rafi did not shield her from the cultural expectations that bound her. Instead, it intensified them. She was no longer just a wife. She was now a mother who must raise a son to uphold the very traditions that had erased her own girlhood. Back in Avaz, her absence was barely noted. Her father viewed the marriage as a completed duty. Her mother, while likely harboring her own quiet sadness, had little power to intervene. Contact with her birth family became infrequent and distant, reduced to obligatory calls and occasional questions about the child's well-being. By the time Layla turned 17 in 2022, her youth had already been eclipsed by a life of obligations. What remained was the echo of a young girl's potential, buried beneath layers of duty, silence, and cultural control. What had begun as a quiet life, filled with curiosity and promise, had, in just a few years, been reshaped into a portrait of endurance. But as the world would later come to know, this was only the beginning of a much darker and more tragic journey. Since her marriage at very young age to Karim Jalali, nearly a decade her senior, Layla's role had never evolved. She remained a subordinate figure within her husband's household, tending to chores from dawn until dusk, raising her young son, and fulfilling duties expected of a wife, regardless of her emotional or physical well-being. Karim, now in his mid-20s, had grown increasingly withdrawn and possessive. His perception of marital authority was drawn from a rigid cultural script, one in which discipline, control, and silence were equated with respect. He worked long hours at a metal fabrication shop, returning home with the expectation of a pristine house, a warm meal, and unquestioning obedience. The once rare moments of gentleness between him and Layla had long vanished. In their place was a tense and heavily monitored existence. Layla had no personal bank account, no mobile phone of her own, and no freedom to move independently through her environment. Trips to the local bakery or corner shop were tightly restricted or conducted under the supervision of her in-laws. Her only reprieve came in fleeting moments, usually when rocking her son Rafi to sleep, or staring out through the iron-barred kitchen window at a sky that promised more than her life could offer. But beneath the layers of compliance and routine, Layla was quietly unraveling. In the summer of 2021, after years of emotional exhaustion and silent suffering, Layla Haroun made a decision that would change everything. Her life had narrowed into a single path, one where silence was expected, obedience was demanded, and even hope felt dangerous. But something inside her refused to fully disappear. With the discreet help of a distant maternal cousin, an older woman who had once escaped a similar life and now lived near the western border, Layla began planning her escape. The goal was not just to flee her home. It was to flee the country, to reach Turkey, where she could finally be safe, away from Karim, his family, and the unspoken laws of shame that ruled her life. It was a plan born not from rebellion, but from desperation. She had nothing left but a few belongings, quiet courage, and the memory of who she used to be. On the chosen morning, Layla packed lightly. A few clothes rolled into a scarf, money her cousin had saved for her, and a small photograph of Rafi, her son, her heartbeat, her greatest sorrow. She had hoped to take him with her. But the risk was too great. Crossing the border with a child would slow her down, draw attention, raise questions. Her cousin urged her to go alone, promising they would reunite once Layla reached safety. With her heart breaking, Layla kissed her sleeping son one last time and whispered a promise to return. She traveled quietly, changing vehicles near the border and moving through rural checkpoints with forged documents and a headscarf pulled low. After days of careful movement and breathless caution, Layla made it. She crossed into Turkey, alone, afraid, but free. For a few days, she stayed in a safe house provided by a small women's aid group her cousin had contacted. She ate without fear, slept without someone watching. For the first time in years, she opened a window without asking for permission. But freedom, for someone like Layla, was never guaranteed. Hold on a moment. If you're still watching, it means this story has already struck a nerve. If you believe no one should be punished for choosing freedom, if you believe silence should never be the price of survival, then please subscribe. Every story we tell gives voice to those who were never heard in time. Tap that button. Hit the bell. Let's make sure no one like Layla is ever forgotten again. News of her escape quickly reached her family in Avaz. Karim's relatives were outraged, but it was her own blood who acted. Layla's father, Majid Haroun, began contacting her through distant relatives, urging her to come home. He told her that Rafi missed her, that things could be resolved, that if she just came back, they would talk, forgive, and move forward as a family. Phone calls turned into video messages. A cousin was sent to Turkey to bring her back peacefully. She was promised that no harm would come to her, that she would be allowed to see her son, that Karim had agreed to reconcile. Exhausted, isolated in a foreign country, and aching to see her child again, Layla gave in. She agreed to return, believing that maybe, just maybe, her father meant what he said. But from the moment she crossed the border back into Iran, everything changed. She was not greeted with open arms, but with cold silence. She was not taken to her son, but to Karim's family home. Her documents were taken, her movements monitored. Rafi was placed in the care of Karim's mother. Layla was stripped, slowly, deliberately, of every ounce of freedom she had just tasted. Her in-laws said little, but watched her constantly. Karim refused to speak to her directly. Her father, who had promised her peace, did not visit. No one asked how she felt. No one acknowledged the pain she had just endured. Instead, rumors began to spread. In the community, neighbors were told that Layla had run away with a stranger, that she had brought shame to her husband, that she had returned because she had nowhere else to go. The lies came quickly, and no one questioned them. Layla was no longer a wife or a mother in that household. She was a prisoner. The books she once read were gone. Her room was stripped of anything personal. Even her meals were given to her in silence. Her punishment was not just isolation, it was erasure. The days blurred into weeks. Rafi, the child she had left to save, was kept at a distance. Her only moments of comfort came from hearing him laugh through the walls. And deep inside, she knew the truth. She had not come home. She had been pulled back into a trap, and this time, there would be no escape. By the end of 2021, Layla Haroun was a shell of the vibrant child she had once been. Her voice, once filled with poems and wonder, had been stripped by years of coercion, expectation, and cultural silence. She had tried to run, she had tried to speak, and each time the response was the same: control, denial, punishment. Her story had not ended, but the next chapter was already closing in. And what would follow would shake the conscience of a nation. By late January 2022, the tension inside Karim Jalali's household had grown unbearable. Layla's presence, once tightly controlled and hidden behind closed doors, had become the subject of renewed gossip. A single image, circulated quietly among extended relatives and neighbors, lit a fire that had been smoldering since her return from Turkey. The photograph, blurry and taken months earlier, showed Layla seated in what appeared to be a safe house or humanitarian shelter. She was beside a man, his face partially out of frame. Layla's headscarf had slipped back slightly, revealing more of her than conservative norms would tolerate. She wasn't laughing, touching anyone, or doing anything inappropriate, but her very presence in that space, unveiled and among strangers, was enough to spark suspicion. To Karim, the photo was more than a picture. It was humiliation. A wound reopened. The image suggested she had not only defied him by fleeing the country, but had dared to be seen, without his control, without his permission, and possibly with another man. In a culture where a woman's body is often viewed as a symbol of a man's honor, that single frame felt like betrayal. The whispers began again, louder and more vicious. In conservative parts of Avaz, honor is treated like currency, something that must be guarded, and if lost, avenged. Karim had already faced shame after Layla's escape. Now, with this image in circulation, his pride felt irreparably damaged. He was mocked in hushed tones and stared at in silence. People asked questions, and to Karim, questions meant judgment. He didn't want justice. He wanted revenge. In the final days of January, someone from the family reached out to Layla with a message. Her father wanted to meet. A neutral place was suggested. Layla, tired of conflict and desperate for peace, agreed. She dressed modestly. She kissed her son goodbye. She believed it would be a short conversation, a possible path to understanding. But the meeting never happened. It was a lie. Instead, she returned home to a quiet, cold household. That evening, in the privacy of their own home, Karim acted. Layla was murdered in the very space where she had once folded clothes, cooked meals, and tried to hold her life together. With a blade he had brought in advance, Karim separated her head from her body in a planned, deliberate act. His younger brother, while not present during the killing, was later arrested for suspected involvement in helping plan or conceal the crime. The horror didn't end behind closed doors. What followed shocked the country. Karim, still wearing the same blood-stained clothes, walked out into the streets of Farsabad, not to flee, but to make a statement. He carried Layla's head in one hand and the murder weapon in the other. His face, witnesses said, showed no remorse. He moved slowly, calmly, like someone proud of what he had done. Some people screamed. Others fled. Many simply stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. A bystander raised a phone. One photograph was taken. That image, horrific and unforgettable, traveled faster than anyone could have imagined. It pierced through social media filters and censors. It landed on news sites, on advocacy pages, in the hands of stunned readers around the world. Karim was arrested later that day. His brother was taken into custody soon after. Layla's father, despite his role in pressuring her return from Turkey, faced no legal consequences. Layla Haroun's final moments happened not in a courtroom, not in a crowd, but in her own home, by the hand of a man she was told to love and obey. Her death wasn't a random tragedy. In his initial interrogation, Karim showed no regret. He justified his actions as defense of family dignity. In his view, Layla had defied him, embarrassed him, and broken unspoken codes that he considered sacred. The community reaction was split. While many were horrified and condemned the act, there were still voices, quiet but present, who believed that Karim had done what was necessary to salvage honor. It exposed a deep, systemic rot, one where the very structures meant to protect girls like Layla, families, local councils, courts, often acted as silent enablers of abuse. Back in Avaz, Layla's mother, Sabah Haroun, remained unseen. There were no public statements, no visible mourning. Layla's siblings, still young, were shielded from the details. And Rafi, now only a few years old, was left without a mother. Layla Haroun had lived a life governed by control, expectation, and silence. She had asked for nothing but freedom, and she paid for that hope with her life. Her final moments were not marked by chaos or chance, but by a planned execution carried out by those who believe that a woman's existence is only valid if it remains within the narrow framework of submission. What began as a child's journey through rigid customs had ended in a tragedy that the world would not forget. But even in death, Layla did something powerful. She forced the world to look. Her story, once hidden behind walls, was now in full view, and no one, no matter how hardened, could ignore what had been done in the name of honor. But this time, the public did not stay quiet. Protests erupted in major cities. In Tehran, Isfahan, and Shiraz, thousands marched with placards bearing Layla's name. She had been a child bride, a silenced victim, and now a national symbol. Her killing forced open a conversation long buried beneath tradition and fear. Activists demanded an end to child marriage. Women's rights groups condemned the use of honor as legal defense. International organizations joined the call for reform. In response, the Iranian Ministry of Justice launched a formal investigation. Karim and his brother were swiftly brought to trial. The case was expedited, held behind closed doors, but under immense public pressure. Prosecutors outlined the facts, the premeditation, the method, the public display, and the societal trauma that followed. Karim faced charges of intentional homicide and public disturbance. His brother faced lesser charges related to complicity. The defense leaned heavily on cultural context, arguing that Karim had been driven by humiliation, family pressure, and deeply embedded societal codes. While the court rejected justifying the act entirely, elements of that argument would linger in the sentencing. In June 2022, the verdict was delivered. Karim Jalali was sentenced to 8 years and 2 months in prison, 7 years and 6 months for murder, 8 months for public display of a weapon. But the sentence sparked further outrage. Many believed it was far too lenient. The punishment, they argued, did not reflect the severity of the act, nor the message it had sent to the public. Under Iranian law, elements like family forgiveness and cultural motivation are still weighed heavily in sentencing. In Layla's case, her father's lack of pursuit for additional punishment likely influenced the outcome. Without a formal request from the victim's family for the death penalty or harsher consequences, the court was legally limited in its options, even in the face of public horror. Karim's brother received a reduced sentence, and his role faded from headlines. No charges were ever brought against Layla's father, Majid Haroun, despite his suspected role in orchestrating her presence at the crime scene. The system that had failed to protect her in life once again protected those complicit in her death. Even after sentencing, the protests did not stop. Layla's name became more than a memory. It became a movement. Her face appeared on murals across Iran, her story told in classrooms and conferences, her name shouted in the streets. Across platforms, activists launched campaigns calling for legislative change, especially around child marriage and the leniency granted in so-called honor cases. Lawmakers promised to reconsider the legal age of marriage for girls and reform laws related to domestic violence and family consent in criminal cases. But for many, these gestures felt hollow. There was no clear timeline for action, no indication that deep structural reform would follow. And for Layla, any change would come far too late. Her son, Rafi, was left behind. Now in the care of Kareem's mother, his future remained uncertain. There were no official announcements of state support, counseling, or interventions. The boy who once clung to his mother's shawl would grow up with pieces of a story that others had tried to bury. Layla Haroun's final chapter in life was written not by her, but by a culture that chose silence over justice. Yet, her name broke through that silence. Her death forced a nation to listen, to confront what honor truly means, and what it should never cost. In the small town of Farsabad, where Layla had lived and died, the community's mood shifted uncomfortably. The street where Kareem had carried out his final public act became known for all the wrong reasons. Some neighbors moved away, unwilling to be associated with a place that now stood as a symbol of failed justice. Others stayed silent, unsure whether to speak or forget. But Layla's story didn't fade. It was cited in legislative discussions, in international reports, and in classrooms where young women were now asking harder questions. Her name became a symbol of what happens when silence is mistaken for stability, and of what must change to prevent another life from being taken in the name of control. Though Layla's voice had been taken from her, her story continued to speak loud enough that a country could no longer look away. If you believe stories like Layla's must be heard, if you believe no one should ever pay with their life for seeking freedom, subscribe to our channel to help amplify these voices. Don't forget to hit the bell so you never miss a story that matters.